Jó napot kívánok, hölgyeim és uraim! A Virág Andrea vagyok, a Republikon Intézet stratégiai igazgatója. Itt az elején gyorsan magyarul még mondok egy-két szolgálati közleményt, utána át is váltanék angolra, mert a konferencia első fele angol nyelven fog zajlani. Éppen ezért szerettem volna elmondani, hogy akinek szinkrontolmácsolásra van szüksége, az itt mellettem tud készüléket szerezni. Az egyes csatornán magyarul, az 5-ös csatornán pedig angolul tudják hallgatni a rendezvényt. Az első szekció angol nyelven, a második szekció pedig magyar nyelven fog zajlani. Illetve még annyit gyorsan hozzátennék, hogy elnézést kérünk. Ugye azt ígértük, hogy az első szekcióban egy szlovák, egy lengyel és egy magyar politikustól hallhatnak, de sajnos Bert Dánielnek egy súlyos, vagy hát személyes probléma jött közben ma reggel, úgyhogy ő nem tud hozzánk csatlakozni, de szerintem így is egy nagyszerű beszélgetés lesz. És akkor át is váltanék angolra. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrea Virag. I am Director of Strategy at Republikon Institute. I would like to welcome everyone at today's event organized by Republikon and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Today we are going to discuss the changing political landscape in our region and in Europe. Without a doubt, it's a very crucial time for both our region and the whole European Union, just after battling with COVID, learning to live with the pandemic. We are facing new unexpected challenges, of course, with Russia invading a neighboring country, Ukraine, and with a deepening economic and energy crisis. Unfortunately, we know that extremist political forces tend to thrive in times of crisis. So we are convinced that finding liberal answers to today's challenges are more important than ever. That's what we are trying to try to do in the next few hours. And to do that, in the first half of the conference, you are going to hear the experiences and thoughts of politicians from Poland and Slovakia. And in the second half of the conference, Hungarian political experts will discuss the Hungarian political landscape. Without being too long, I would like to thank first and foremost the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for supporting our conference. I would like to thank our speakers for accepting our invitation, and of course thank all of you who joined our event either here in person or via the online streaming. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Márton Schlanger, my colleague, who will be the moderator of the first panel discussion. I wish everyone a very interesting few hours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome everyone to this conference. In the first panel, we are going to talk about the state of and the situation of liberalism, especially in Central Europe, in light of recent events and so on. I have two speakers here with me. Adam Szłapka, who is the president of the Polish Nowoczesna party, and Zora Jaurova, who is a board member of Progressive Slovakia, which is a party in Slovakia. And I'm Márton Schlanger, the researcher of Republikon Institute. Thank you for coming, and let's start off with something sort of to put ourselves in place. We are talking about liberalism, and we will talk about it a lot today. So it's only right to talk about it shortly, what the word, or sort of the word liberalism means in the context of your own country, and sort of how you would synthesize it, what it means to you, or what's the sort of the essence of liberalism and also illiberalism to you and to your country or in your country. And whoever wants to start.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's I'm glad to be here with my liberal friends from Center Europe. We have many things in common, and that's the great opportunity to talk about liberalism. And the first, of course, liberalism is being responsible, and the freedom, and taking responsible for the freedom, and in different aspects, and cultural freedom and economic freedom. But when we are talking about the liberalism now, especially in the Central Europe, first we need to think about the liberal democracy, I think, because there's no liberalism in any sense without liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is based on values of liberalism, freedom of speech, free media, judiciary system, the rule of law, human rights, and without any of these values, we cannot think and talk about the liberal democracy. So there is no liberal democracy without human rights. There is no liberal democracy without free media. There is no liberal democracy without rule of law. There is no democracy without freedom of speech. So every this type of values, which is the part of liberalism, it's connected with liberal democracy, and there is no liberalism in society without liberal democracy. And this is the very big dangers, in Hungary. We also know that in Poland, that we are now not liberal democracy. We are some kind of electoral democracy. Of course, there are free media, free elections in our countries, but we cannot say that these elections were fair. So, for example, I'm talking about the access to the media, public media, for example, in Poland. So when we are talking about liberalism, first I think we need to talk about the liberal democracy, because without liberal democracy, there is no normal democratic games, election games in the country, and then you cannot fight for liberal ideas with, for example, social democrats, with conservative. First, you need to think about restore the liberal democracy. But for me, also liberalism, according to the situation of Central Eastern Europe and European Union, is also the integration, because I think the process of European integration is also connected with liberalism, because integration of European Union secure these values of liberal democracy, because European Union is built on the same values: democracy, free market, freedom of speech, human rights, rule of law, and all these values on which is European Union built are from liberalism. So when we are talking about liberalism, there is liberals as a responsible and freedom, liberal democracy, and European integration.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation as well. Yes, Adam started with the talk on liberal democracy, which I also think is in the core of this debate. And I think we should be very careful with the terminology here. Because when I read your questions you sent me yesterday, you very often talked about liberal and illiberal democracy in these things. I think we should watch our language, because the democracy, as we understand it in Western modern society, is always liberal democracy. There is nothing else. That's the democracy. Everything else is not being considered democratic in terms of how we understand the democracy after the Second World War. And of course, everybody knows here that it's Farid Zakaria who came with the expression illiberal democracy at the end of the 90s, which he used as a threat. And then Viktor Orban took this term and he started to introduce it in the public discourse as something which is a legitimate alternative to liberal democracy. But that's not true, and we shouldn't do this comparison. We shouldn't talk about liberal and illiberal democracy in the same sentence as if it were two alternatives, because they are not. Maybe I don't want to go too much to the terminological debate here, but maybe here it is important to underline what is the core of the liberal democracy, because the democracy means that the simple majority decides. That's oversimplification, but that's in the core of what democracy means. And to be honest, I think the antique democracy wouldn't be really considered democracy in our today's terms, because there were maybe 10% of the citizens really having the access to the power. But now we consider as democratic something which is called liberal democracy, and liberal means that we somehow accepted that there are rights, people have rights, they are unalienable. That's what the US Constitution says. So these rights cannot be taken and not be denied and not be fought against even by majority. And that's the liberal democracy, and that's what we are talking about here. And I think this is very important to emphasize, because it's not only Viktor Orbán, it's going everywhere. In my country, people would say we don't want liberal democracy because we are conservatives. We don't want these liberal things. But then we try to explain to them liberal democracy is not something liberal, it's the democracy itself, is what we understand as the democracy. So, and with the terminology. And coming to the Central and Eastern European situation, I think there is another aspect of this which is quite important, and that is that from the very beginning of the transformation process at the end of in 1989, from various reasons, the political liberalism was totally associated with economic liberalism, and they've been almost like presented as these two are the same. And again, it's not true. Of course, there was a lot of reasons for that, because the transformation was run by like intellectuals and dissidents who were the political liberals, but there was a deep need to transform the economies, and that's where the economic liberals came into the game. However, now we see that the classical economic neoliberalism has failed. I have to say that. And I think people feel it. And that's one of the core of anti-liberal tendencies in the society. But so I find also very important to distinct between the political liberalism and economic liberalism, especially its neoliberal part, which has been very often presented in Central and Eastern Europe in the time of transformation as the only solution for moving the country forward.
Yes, thank you. It is important to say, of course, that liberal values is what our modern democracy is based on. So even in some way, conservatism is also based on liberalism because it's reactive to that. But when, let's say, the right wing describes liberalism, they mean something completely different under liberalism. And many of our governments in this region are also right wing, and they also describe liberalism quite differently. And like you said, liberalism is something that we all have in common because it is what the EU is built on. But if we have leaders that, for some reason, denounce liberalism, the term liberalism, or just the liberal way of governance, do you think that even though we are united in our liberal democracies, so to say, even though there are problems, would you say that this denouncement of liberalism could drive a wedge between, let's say, Central Eastern Europe or some of our countries and the EU, as a whole? Do you think that in Central Eastern Europe this is a threat, that the very foundations of liberal democracy are questions, and this distances us from the rest of the EU?
Of course, this is the big threat for us in Central Eastern Europe, because there are very, very strong populist tendencies in our societies. But still, on example of Poland, I think the Polish society is deeply divided on the, let's say, democratic part and I wouldn't say conservative part, but I would say populist, something between populism and nationalism, which is really, really, really dangerous. And because this democratic part is like in normal democratic societies divided because people have different views, and being a populist, you are keeping all the ideas on the leader for, let's say, it may be Orban, it may be Kaczynski or someone else. So they are using the values of liberal democracy to win the election and be the threat for these values. But first, I think that's why the European Union is so important, because without European Union, without our decision on the beginning of transformation that we want to be part of Europe, of this Europe of values, we wouldn't be part of European Union. And for example, Orban and for example Kaczynski, after winning the election, they could move much more forward in destroying liberal democracy. I'm sure because European Union is protecting liberal values also in Central European Union. So I think, of course, populism is a big threat, but still, I'm pretty sure that when we are talking about Poland, I'm sure, because there's a hope in the Polish society, and I'm sure the opposition is going to win the next election. I think if it will be necessary where we create one opposition bloc, I'm actually not sure if it will be necessary, because according to the polls, the opposition parties has now the majority, and I think during this year there will be stronger. But there is a threat, and thinking about the future, we need to think how to make the liberal democracy. I actually agree that if we are talking about democracy, it is liberal democracy. It is democracy. When we are talking about democracy, it is liberal democracy, and full stop. But after 25 years of transformation in Poland, it was great success. I'm sure of that. We have changed in many ways, but we know where we did the mistakes. Because of these mistakes, the populists won the election and tried to destroy democracy. So, first thing on the future, it's deeper integration with European Union and keeping the European Union values and being strong with these values. For example, rule of law. It's the very, very important values, and we should be, as European institution and European countries, we should be very principled on that. It's the first thing. The second thing, making the institution of democracy strong. So constitutional courts, judiciary system, free media, these values must be stronger on the base of constitution. And third thing, we, especially in Central Europe, we need to think about the election system to be real proportional, because in 2015, peace in Poland wanted, not because they took the majority, because majority of society voted for them, because the electoral system, because the left parties didn't enter to the parliament. So it was just some kind of, so they just get it. So it's of course threat, but I think we need to think about the future, and still I believe that liberal democracy and European integration will win in Poland and also in Hungary and for sure in Slovakia.
Thank you. So once again, the question was whether some of these leaders in Europe who denounce liberalism and liberal democracy, actually quite recently Hungary was deemed the electoral autocracy, I think, by the EU. So do you think that these leaders could drive a wedge between the sort of mainstream EU politics, which we assume is still a liberal democracy, and these countries, which are our countries?
First of all, I think that so far, the way the European Union is dealing or not dealing with the situation in Hungary is the biggest fail of European Union since the enlargement. That's my deep conviction, and I think they should act earlier, stronger, and more sort of rapid. And I'm saying it because I follow the Hungarian politics very closely. And I also remember extremely well the 90s in Slovakia, when we had the Prime Minister Mečiar, and we've been expelled from the accession to the EU and NATO, and we've been the black hole of Central and Eastern Europe. I remember that atmosphere in the society. However, at that time, the whole democratic world was trying to help us, and the leverage of the accession to the EU and NATO was used as an argument against these authoritarian tendencies. However, Hungary is in maybe even worse situation now, and it is the member of the European Union, and so far the mechanisms in the EU didn't prove strong enough to deal with it, and I think it has to be dealt with it, because if the European Union wouldn't be able to do that, then it can be a destroying factor for something we cherished for decades and which is the only solution for the European future. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think it's very important to understand the origins of those anti-liberal tendencies in Central and Eastern Europe. As Adam said, we have to learn from the past and from the mistakes of the transformation. And there are many, of course, but I would highlight three. I think they are relevant to this debate. The first is that as I said, the transformation was run by intellectuals and neoliberal economists in most of the countries, which resulted in not paying enough attention to building strong democratic institutions. Because, of course, the neoliberals think the smallest state possible is the best. So the smallest institutions, not very strong regulation, and so on. And the intellectuals, they didn't, I think, understood enough that this is important. And you could see it now in many countries. For example, you could see that in Great Britain, even if they went through this nightmare of Brexit, the country is still democratic because the strength of the democratic institutions somehow keep the country. If that happened in our latitude, I'm not sure we will survive as the Britain did. And also, I can see it when I compare, for example, Czech Republic and Slovakia, because that's two countries connected with the history and with very common history. In Czech Republic, throughout the last decades, the democratic institutions there are much stronger than in Slovakia because they have been built for a longer time, and they've been the safeguards of the development in the country. However, in Slovakia, with every government, everything changes and we start from the scratch. So if we think about what to do for the future and what would be the main program of parties like ours, which want to protect the liberal democracy, I think the first point on the list is to build strong democratic institutions, because these are the only safeguards of the democracy in the long term about the political cycles. The second failure, or the second thing which I think was neglected in the transformational process, and it's even more complicated, is that somehow in that process, the idea of the reformators was, let's make a thick line here, and now we will build a better future. Let's forget what was there. Let's forget the communist history. Let's forget what was before, because now, from now on, we are building the better society, which is very, idealistic in a way, but it doesn't work, because the importance of memory and the past identities and the past stories and the traumas and the memory is so important, because that is what the identity is built on. And you cannot build the identity from the scratch, because then the neglected demons from your past are haunting you. And the result of it is that there is the lack of identity. And we see it in different forms in different Central European countries. Of course, Poland has completely different history and relation to the identity than does the Hungary or Slovakia, which did not exist 30 years ago as a independent country. However, I think this is one of the cores of anti-liberal tendencies, that people are longing for some strong identity, who we are, what we can relate to, what are what we can be proud of. And I think this is a very, very difficult task for liberal parties, because on one hand, we are not, and I don't think we will ever be lured by this nationalistic identity discourse. On the other hand, I don't think the sole European identity will solve the issue. Because, the national history is there, the national identities are there. And to be honest, I don't have a really good solution for this. The only thing I think we should talk about is how to build new stories of the countries. They are not that much built on how good we are as a nation, but how good and proud we are about our country as a part of a bigger context. Easy to say, very difficult to make, because of course the populists and the right-wing populists, they always have this much easier story about make Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, America great again. And they can always relate to non-existing past mythologies and so on. And the third thing, which I find important to mention, which I think was neglected during the transformation process, is that after the fall of the communism, and because of the neoliberal transformation, there was a lot of attention paid to forcing the individual rights of individual people, but there was very little or almost none attention paid to some, like, to that part of the society which is beyond the individual rights. So, for example, in Slovakia, we have a legislation which protects the individual ownership of buildings, of everything. And when this guy over there with this building decides to paint it in bright pink and green, he can do that because it's his private property. And there is no legislation which would force the public good. And you could see it to various degrees in all our countries that the public domain is neglected. And it's not only the question of physical public space, which of course makes the quality of life and so on, but it's also the issue of virtual public space, of the public debate, of the way we actually negotiate for the rights of the communities. And again, the result of it is that people feel the heavy burden of having the individual responsibilities, but there is very little feeling of like being together, of empathy, of society which does good for everybody, not just for individual people. And again, this is used by the populists. And again, this is something which, especially after the pandemics, we have to address, and we have to find the solution how to actually make the public domain much better place than it is now.
Thank you. Zora brought up some very interesting things. For example, regarding sort of this looking back and sort of the heritage of previous political systems, sort of something that we cannot outgrow in our countries. And you also said that Slovakia, to some extent, this isn't the case because there is no sort of nostalgia for these types of things, or not as much as, for example, in Hungary. And it reminded me recently, I heard this expression in the context of Italian politics, but I thought it applied also to Hungary and some other countries. I heard about, so someone told me that Italian politics and Italian right-wing politicians, they are not talking about, in their politics, they are not talking about utopias, they are sort of envisioning a retrotopia, sort of making society good again, like in America, looking back and bringing back our country into the golden age. And this is something, this retrotopistic thinking is sort of something that we have also in Hungary, and maybe not so much in Slovakia. We will have to see. They do. Will be interesting to hear about that. But here we are. You also said how our parties are. I mean, I'm not in a party. You are in a party, but we also have Momentum, and I have to talk about them. So all three of these parties, Progressive Slovakia, Nowoczesna, and Momentum, they are, compared to some other players in the field, they are sort of more newer, more fresh parties. Also, in some cases, with younger politicians and so on. Do you see that even in these retros? So the first question is whether this retrotopia applies to your country. The second question is if these sort of fresher parties and what we call liberal values, or what, because these parties are being called the liberal parties from the right or the left, do you think they can find their way into mainstream politics, these parties, and do you think it's possible in a retrotopistic society, or how possible is it?
First, this retrotopia, or talking about the very simple way about the identity, it's the methods of building the populist growth. Let's say there are other methods also used in Poland. It's generating fears and giving on these fears a very simple answer. For example, in 2015, peace created the very strong fear against refugees in Poland. It was not only peace. Many European parties did that. But in Poland, actually, people didn't afraid of refugees at all. Because they generated these fears, people started to afraid of refugees. And the very simple answer of peace: we close the borders and only we don't let them to our home, and that's why they get about 3 or 5%, and they win the election. And how the Polish society is open on refugees, you can see after the beginning the war with Ukraine. So it's also the retro utopia, generating fears or building a very black and white history of countries and identity. It's a part of methods of building the populist movement. But when we are talking about the Poland and the other parties or liberal parties on this landscape, the first thing, as I mentioned, the Polish society is maybe one of the most divided societies in Europe, maybe comparing with US society. There's opposition electorate, peace electorate, and there's no connection. It's only about mobilization and demobilization of these electorates, if this part of societies. I think that the opposition part of society is bigger. That's why I think the opposition are going to win the election. But to build, we as a society first need to get back into normal democratic games, because now there is an enormous situation. We are talking about about getting back to liberal democracy, to restore our institutions, constitutional court, the public media in Poland, and other judicial system, for example, and normal situation with democracy. And then I believe that there is a big part of society which is liberal, and I think it's about 10, maybe even 15% of society that are thinking about the liberals in the sense of economic and cultural sense. So I think there is the future for liberals in Poland. But first, we need to win the election. To win the election, we need to cooperate with all opposition parties. Without the cooperation within the opposition, we are not going to win the election and rebuild liberal democracy in Poland. Without rebuilding liberal democracy in Poland, we cannot think about building the liberal organization. So the first step, win the election. Without cooperation and building the bigger coalition, there is no future for liberal movements.
Well, when you speak about the retrotopia, I think it's not only the Central and Eastern European thing, it's the global thing. Watch the series on Netflix. They all happen in 80s, 90s nowadays. Watch the fashion the young people wear. It's totally retro. It's too retro to me as well. And it has a reason. And I think the reason is that because there is like the concept of future has crumbled down, people are naturally coming back to the time when the story of the world made sense. And I think this is something, especially when talking about liberal and progressive parties. Our party is called Progressive Slovakia, meaning we believe in the progress and we believe in the future. This is very hard in the time when people don't see the future as a bright, but they see it as a threat. I was born into the world when I was told by my parents, when I do everything right, I will live in a better world than they did. They believed in it. I was born during the communism. I experienced the change of the society on the threshold of the adulthood. And I've seen in my early teens that the world can be changed from like night to the morning. And I believe in it. My generation believe in it. However, now, when I look at my son, basically the emotion is that I wish he wouldn't live in a much worse world than I do. And this is very different. This has changed over the few decades. And this fear from the future is the main driving force behind all the populism, all the authoritarian tendencies, because this is what fuels it. Now, how to deal with it? That's probably the question, and who comes up with the good answer not only wins the elections, but also save the liberal democracy. However, I think one of the ways to that is that we have to redefine what we mean by the progress. Because since the war, at least since the Second World War, the progress was very often defined mainly in economic terms. It was the idea of constant economic growth, which would bring the prosperity. Now we see it did not bring the prosperity to all. And the constant growth based on ever-increasing consumption has proven itself as non-sustainable model. And this is, I mean, when I talk to my 15-year-old son, he is terribly afraid of the climate catastrophe. He like wakes up in the night with these kind of dreams. So basically, in order to survive, we have to say that we have to change the economic model a lot. But we have to say the B, that it would mean that the constant growth by which we defined our prosperity is not going to be there. The GDP will not increase in that amount as we've been used to, and so on and so on. And so what we can offer to the people to vote for us. And now it will sound very, very sort of idealistic, but I think what we can offer to them is more, is different quality of life, which is based on like well-being for all. I know it sounds terribly sort of idealistic and left-wing blah blah, but that's actually something which we have to translate into like political terminology, that it's not the fact that you will get more and more, but it's the fact you will get better and better. And that's different. Okay, this is the theory. It's very difficult to translate it to like simple political billboards. However, I think that we have to offer hope and future to people, and if we don't, then the populist and illiberal tendencies can easily win.
Thank you. Yes. I would love to talk more about this sort of retro versus future sort of things. I mean, even of course in Hungary, even the way the government works is very retro in the sense that it reminds me of the 80s or 70s. So in some regards, not all regards, of course, there's very big differences. But we have to talk about something else, and it is it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is very important. Just talking about liberalism or the EU in general requires us to reflect on these current events. I have a question that is two parts. Firstly, do you think that sort of this bad example or this scary example that Russia sets to the EU, could it act as a sort of a catalyst, or could it shake up the European politics and Central Eastern European politics, which is sort of very anti-EU, very individualistic, and so on? Do you think that what we see in Russia and just seeing how people's life can change for the worse overnight, do you think could it serve as sort of a catalyst of closer cooperation with the EU, with these countries, or just could it make finding common ground easier for EU countries? Or quite the contrary, maybe this situation radicalizes people and politicians. This is the first part of the question. And the second is, the EU has this so-called sanction politics that's the EU stance in this war. That's how the EU deals with this war, not just with sanctions, but how does sort of the liberal politics and what we have talked about so far relate to this sanction politics? What do you think?
Okay, what's going on in Ukraine now? It's catastrophe, and it's Russian invasion. Russia, it's a terrorist state, and Putin, it's a dictator, which should be punished in the future. It's the first thing, but there are some plus advantages of this situation, I think. And it's actually in your question. The first thing, I think, the situation in Ukraine, it's some kind of very cold shower for some European countries, especially for Germans and France. So their politics, according to Russia and Putin, was completely failed. They were wrong, and they know that. And we need to do everything to change this policy. And I think, yes, it is a good time to let's say, do something like reunion to make more European solidarity and think about the common foreign and security policy, because the history shows us that the European Union is moving forward from crisis to crisis. And this is another crisis that can be really helpful for European integration, because we know that we need to be integrated to secure our values. Because we need to be strong when we are facing the dictatorships, because it's easier to manage dictatorship than democracy. But democracies are stronger. So that's why we should think about the common foreign policy as European Union, for common security policy as European Union, and first of all, common energetic policy as European Union, because the Russia is threat, and being depends on Russian energy sources is very big threat for us as European countries. So I think that Putin brought us together, and we should stay together to be stronger. This is the first thing. And we are asking me about the sanction. I'm really in favor of the policy of sanction, because I think European Union is based on values, and the values are first. So democracy, freedom, human rights, and all the values that Robert Schuman and Adenauer and Monnet were thinking about. They were thinking about the bright idea of European Union, but they started to talk about the European Commonwealth of Coal and Steel, because European society was not ready to talk about the political union. But they were thinking about that, and first we should thinking about the values. So we need to secure these values. It's the first thing. Then we can think about the business as usual. So first, if the Russia is threat, we need to fight with them because they are threat for us. So I'm not in favor only about the stronger and more rash sanctions from European Union to Russia, but I'm also think that European countries and European Union should send the heavy weapons to Ukraine, because when we are talking about our security, now that Ukraine is fighting for our freedom. So if we not stop this dictator on Ukraine, soon he will be on the Polish border and Slovakia and Hungary.
I totally agree with both of you that if the Western democracy will not be able to, let's say, free Ukraine, then it can be one big step from the liberal democracy in the whole Western world. And yeah, I totally agree that it was a cold shower, especially for Germany and especially for countries. They always thought they can somehow renegotiate the space between the democratic and non-democratic Europe. So yeah, definitely, I think one of the important fights for the liberal democracy happens now in Ukraine. But there is one very interesting feature of the whole Ukrainian or Russian war in Ukraine, which is connected to this issue of identity I mentioned, because I already read a lot of analyses and articles by Timothy Snyder and other guys saying that in Ukraine, what's being born is modern nationalism. Because when you think about it, it's really true that a lot of these claims and the ways of proceeding in Ukraine, if they would happen in different contexts, we would consider them very nationalistic. And of course, for them is the way to survive, is the way to sort of unite and fight against the oppressor, against somebody who wants to fully take their identity. And obviously at least we can relate to it in Slovakia, because our sort of quest for national identity was not so far back. I just wonder, after hopefully the war is over and the good wins upon evil, how this will influence the whole debate on identity and national identity in Europe, because I find a lot of those like ideas and tendencies there potentially problematic if they would remain in the time of peace.
Thank you. That's also very interesting to point out that this level of nationalism is really alien to most European countries, especially in those which have not seen war for a long time, and especially in the EU, because within the confines of the EU there has not been wars. There were always wars on the border of the EU, many wars, but never inside the EU or in the past few decades, not inside the EU. And this, because of this, maybe these nationalistic values, we already sort of forgot about the utility of some nationalistic values. But one more thing I would like to ask about, one more question, and then maybe we can open the floor to audience questions. Adam mentioned energy, and I don't think that every party before this conflict had an energy policy, because many parties, especially new parties, and even people, because most voters don't really didn't care as much about energy, especially in the past 10 years when energy prices were just becoming lower and lower. But now this has become one of the key topics in the entirety of Europe. How can or what should a liberal party's take on energy policy be on the EU level, on a local level? Should it be more individualistic, or you know, obviously sustainability and green development comes into the question now as well. But how does liberal and progressive thinking solve this issue of or answer this issue of energy politics and energy crisis?
Of course, we are not living in ideal world where the free market can normally works. I'm talking about, for example, the energy market, where we have such players like Russia, China, or others. So the first thing we need to do as European Union, as liberals, and as European society, it doesn't matter how we call that, but it's the first thing. It's a very deep cooperation within European Union according to the energy. I think we should, like we have common European market, we should have common European energy policy to, for example, to make to buying the energy together. We will be the strongest partner and the strongest player in the world, like United States. So if we can talk with, for example, Saudi Arabia or Iran or any single country being together. This is the first thing, but it's short term, let's say that. But the long term, this crisis with European Union, it's some kind of the biggest opportunity for us to energy revolution. Some of you may could remember the last oil crisis during the Yom Kippur War, when the price on oil grows from, I don't know, from $2 per barrel to $15, astronomical price, $15 per barrel. And it was so deep shock for Western countries that they put very big money to the technological revolution. For example, engines started to consume much less oil, for example. So it's you know, this says but being seriously, it's this crisis gives us opportunity to create great energetic revolution, and we should do everything to improve the technologies and to making our an energetic landscape much more diverse. So renewable energies, wind energy, solar energy, water energy, every renewable energy we should invest in, doing everything to consume less. So it's about technology and keeping European Union together according to energy. So I think this is very big opportunity, and we need to just use it.
But it's hard to add anything to that. I totally agree that this crisis, both the pandemic crisis and the war crisis and energy crisis, is an opportunity. Before Progressive Slovakia was founded as a political party, we as founders wrote this, like it's called Vision of a Country, and it was a political vision for Slovakia for the decades. And when you look in the chapter, which is about the energy policy and circular economy, it can be used fully today. Because I think these both crises only accelerated processes. They already have been there. The technology, the heavy need for the profound change of the whole economic cycle, of the consumption, everything. And energy is one of the most important parts. And also, I think what is interesting about the energy, that it is a sort of metaphor, the whole energy market, because it's not like the market with oil, for example. Oil, you have oil. It's here or it's not here. While energy doesn't work like this. Energy works on a grid. So you cannot actually store the energy when you make it in the power plant, and that's why, by definition, the energy market is a common market. If the power plant makes the energy, they send it to the grid, and it's somewhere there, you know. And it's just like with the pandemics that this has taught us in very cruel way that we cannot survive as individuals. We cannot solve things like pandemics as individual people, as individual countries. We only can solve it and combat it when we work together. And it's the same with the energy, because by definition, energy is this very spiritual thing in a way. I see a lot of opportunities in this crisis, and we just have to take them.
Thank you for answering my questions. And now let's see if the audience has any questions.
Már is adom, viszont magyarul is fel lehet tenni a kérdéseket, és lefordítjuk majd, hogyha úgy van.
Fekete Mihály vagyok, és egy olyan kérdésem volna, amivel azt hiszem eddig sehol nem foglalkoztak. Több millió menekült ukrán ember él most már hónapok óta, vagy fél év óta Nyugat-Európában, illetve az EU területén, és csak reménykedünk abban, hogy vége lesz a háborúnak, de nem tudom, hogy ezek mindenki haza tud-e menni, mert lebombázták a lakását. Ugyanakkor a napokban több százezer orosz menekült is lett Európában, vagy Európa határain, akik nem tudnak biztosan hazamenni akkor, ha Putyin megbukik, mert ahhoz a rendszernek is meg kéne buknia Oroszországban, és ezek az emberek tartósan itt fognak élni, előre láthatólag, ami közös bennük az, hogy Putyint nem szeretik, és közös bennük az, hogy ortodox vallásúak. Számolnunk kell ezekkel az emberekkel választási szempontokból is, mert előbb-utóbb nagyon sokan közülük be fognak ágyazódni az Európai Unió lakosságába, és nem közömbös nekünk, hogy ezek milyen beállítottságú emberek lesznek, vagy maradnak. Mert attól, hogy elmenekült például egy orosz fiatalember Oroszországból, az nem biztos, hogy nem ment volna el harcolni mondjuk a törökök vagy a kazakok ellen. Lehet, hogy ukrán felmenői vannak, és ezért az ukránok ellen nem harcol, de viszont más emberek ellen harcolna. Ezeknek a befogadása és, hogy mondjam, választói csatarendbe állítása nagyon fontos lehet számunkra, liberálisoknak. Köszönöm szépen.
So the question is basically, he mentioned that many people from Ukraine fled the war and came to the European Union, and also in recent days many Russians fled the war and came to the EU, and in the long run these people might, so for Ukrainians maybe they would want to go back, but maybe they won't have a place to go back to and they will stay here. For Russians, they would want to go back, but even if Putin fails, the system still stays intact, so they would want to stay. So what do we think about the long-term integration of these people into European societies and into the voters, the European voters, as these people are, they share it, so they all dislike Putin, of course, and they're all Orthodox, but they are different culturally. So the question is basically this, how will they assimilate, and what is our task in assimilating these people into the EU?
It's a very interesting question. Last week, because I also work as an advisor to the mayor of Bratislava, and last week we met together actually also with Budapest mayor in Prague with Vitaly Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kiev. And we had a long debate with him about how to rebuild Ukraine. And this was his main message, that he said, help us to rebuild our cities because we need our people to come back. And we know now that old people and people who are not in productive age, they would come back because of, obviously, they have more tithes. But the young people, productive people, talented people, they basically can live everywhere and they see that the conditions are better and so on. So help us, our people come back and help us rebuild the country. So I think it starts here, actually, that in terms of the help to Ukraine, it's not that we don't want them here. By the way, they are good for us as well because they are talented people, they help the economy and so on. But in order to really help Ukraine, we need to work with them so the people who are now here would come back and would help to rebuild the country. That's A. B, of course, some of those people will stay. It's, as you said. And to be honest, I don't think this is a big threat to our societies. It's just the opposite, because we already in Slovakia benefit so much from like doctors who fled Ukraine. We have lack of medical doctors, and now we are employing the Ukrainian medical doctors and other professions. And also, well, it's hard to say what will be their political views, but considering the fact they fled the country which was attacked by totally illiberal regime, that could be addition to the liberal and pro-democratic voters in our countries, if I put it in this very cynical way. However, coming back to what I said at the beginning, I think it's in our interest to help Ukraine to create conditions so their people can come back and rebuild the country, so the country flourish, and it's getting better after the war.
Before the war, in Poland there were about 1 million of Ukrainian migrants, which were working in Poland and normally lives, and there was no problems with that. And after the war, during maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, 1 week or 2 weeks. To Poland came 3.5 million refugees. The population of society increased about 10%. So it's the great number. It's 98% was women's and children's. So it's not the wave or just refugees, because men stayed in Ukraine, and actually it's increasing population about 10%. So it's a huge number, and it's more than half a year, and there's no problems with that actually. Of course, there are the Russian propaganda and Russian trolls, and this hybrid wars is trying to work on that, spreading fake news in internet and trying to divide the Polish society and Ukrainians. But actually, there is very big solidarity. So I don't think that it will be problem with integration of Ukrainians in Polish society. Many of these refugees are going back to Ukraine, but I think most of them are feeling safe in Poland and thinking about staying for a longer time, but less than half is going to stay for a long term. Most of them are thinking about going back home after the war will end, and I don't think there will be any problems with them. Maybe because of our language, it's easier to learn Polish from Ukrainian. We can be very close with our Hungarian brothers, but I couldn't understand anything you're asking. But according to the people who are escaping from Russia, actually, we cannot compare these waves at all. First, to be honest, and it's not easy to say, but there's no any well-organized opposition in Russia, and unfortunately, most of Russian society is supporting the war in Ukraine. Unfortunately. And this wave of people are escaping. They are not because they are afraid of the Russian regime, or they are the oppositionists and they were fighting, they were protested or doing something that they are afraid of mobilization. And many of them were actually supporting the invasion if he won't go to the front. But still, there are, of course, some refugees we are trying to escape, and I think I think that tourist visa and all type of visas, except taking the refugees, real refugees, should be banned from Russia. It's one type of sanction, and actually, Garry Kasparov, which is what time of Russian oppositionist, he said the idea that we can give the visa to Russians, visa to Schengen, but to get visa you need to sign the paper that Ukraine is the one country and Crimea is Ukraine, and Donbass is all this territory which are now occupied by Russia is Ukrainian territory. If you sign it, you can appeal for Schengen visa. So of course there are refugees, but we cannot compare at all the people which are escaping from the war from Ukraine with the people which are escaping to the Russian army because Putin decided to invade a sovereign country.
I think we have time for one more, and I'll give you these so you can hear exactly what they are asking you. I don't know if it's working or.
Okay, thanks so much for your lectures, and thanks for the Republikon Institute for the tasty coffee I enjoyed in this morning. Das First half of my question concerns the lady from Slovakia. At the very beginning of this conference, you mentioned the rule of law. And I'm asking in English because I am very angry with the translation in Hungarian language of the term of the rule of law as the state of law, a jogállam in Hungarian. It is a complete nonsense because the rule of law concerns not only the state, the rule of law concerns not only that problem that such a person who has no experience in law, in the job of judge, is a supreme judge in Hungary, or Hungarians know whom I speak of. The rule of law concerns the everyday life. Thus, my question concerns that how these societies which suffered by so-called mental genocide, I may understand, we have not so much time, how these societies can learn that rule of law must work whenever I go to a shop to purchase a piece of bread. And very briefly, because I'm a historian of East Europe and Ukraine, and contribute by one word, that Poland is a very, very huge country with a huge capital. And in Ukraine, there are raw materials. The Dutch Royal Shell already began to exploit the gas and oil in the Donbass. And under the sea, at the coast of Crimea, there is oil and gas. And the third great field of oil and gas is located in West Ukraine, around Lviv, Lemberg in Polish, Ternopil, and in Transcarpathia. That's why Putin provides a Russophile regime in Hungary, because this third territory of oil and gas can be reached only across Hungary. Thus my question is that when the war ends, and I hope it will end by, I hope that Ukraine will join Europe. What perspectives can you see that Polish capital can be invested in Ukraine, and Poland can play similar role as Dutch Royal Shell when it can return to the Donbass? Because this war is about oil and gas in brackets. So what a role can play the huge Polish capital in restoring and development of Ukraine after the good end of the war? Thanks so much.
Okay, I will start with Ukraine. So I also hope that the war will finish fast, but the finish is the full win of Ukraine and taking the Crimea and Donbass and all this territory which are now occupied by Russian army. It's the first thing, but when you are asking about the participating in recovering Ukraine economy and rebuilding the Ukraine, I think what has happened during the last 7 months, but actually I also remember the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, the support of Poles. I also participated in this. I was in Kyiv that time, and the Orange Revolution, the relation between Poles and Ukrainians are really good. And now this relation are, it's even very difficult to find the exact word to describe this. So I think the ground of the good cooperation we have. Everything depends on being smart, to have the smart politics to conduct it. Because I think when we are talking about the society, when we are talking the private companies, it will be really okay. I think many Poles are going to invest. Many Ukrainians are working in Poland and are owning their own company in Poland now, are going to participate in that. Many Ukrainians will invite Polish companies and Polish capital to Ukraine. But you are asking about the big deals, according to the oil, according to the coal, according to the iron and all this. So it depends on being smart politics, because I think the Ukrainian government will cooperate with any Polish government, but it's to be good manager and try to use this opportunity to be there, and I think it's possible. And before the war, Poland was, I think, the second on the first partner when we are talking about the trade with Ukraine, maybe the third, because the first was China and we were above the Russia. So even Ukraine was buying all gas, for example, from Ukraine. The Polish trade relation with Ukraine was better than Ukrainian Russian. So I think this is a great opportunity for Ukraine and Poland and a good chance. And by the way, in Polish, Lviv is Lvów. Lemberg is in German.
Maybe just one remark. We've been talking a lot about the fact that we are missing the big idea of the future, and that this is the problem of the political leaders. And I start to have the feeling that the rebuilding of Ukraine can be the next big idea. Maybe not that big than foundation of European Union, but maybe even bigger, because it can be the task for the whole European Union. It actually can be the task where Central and Eastern Europe plays a really important role, because we understand them, we are on the border, we have the ties with them. However, of course, coming back to the idea of rule of law, it's very difficult to help to rebuild the country when you don't have the rule of law and the liberal democracy principles in your own country. So basically, what happens in Central Europe now, the governments and so on, it's not only important for our countries, but it's also important for the broader context and maybe also the whole rebuilding of Ukraine, and the future landscape of Europe will be very much depending upon it.
Thank you. And I think that marks the end of the first panel. Thank you again, Adam Szłapka and Zora Jaurova, for this interesting discussion, and thank you for the audience for being here. And don't go anywhere, please. The next panel will be also very interesting. It will be in Hungarian. And one more thing I have to talk to you about is that there's some books on the tables which are free to take home if you want. There are some policy issues, very interesting, so please do. But for now, thank you for our panelists for being here.
Thank you.